be done. Okay. So basically, what's the topic? The title is Learning and Choice in Affective Disorder. It's pretty a broad topic, and the idea is just to introduce some tasks, some recent results of the three speakers about what is learning and what is the process of decision making. So the idea is that making any choice requires knowledge about the state of the world. The problem that often the state of the world is incomplete. That kind of knowledge is incomplete, and that encompasses a certain degree of uncertainty of the world around us. This can be particularly relevant in affective disorder, and in affective disorder, I'm talking more broadly about depression and anxiety. And for example, we hope that what they are going to present, this will help in understanding what is how, for example, a depressed subject can learn from an extremely unlikely event, so something that is really rare, or even balanced information. For example, like if I have to leave the house, what's the likelihood of me falling down the stairs? Or otherwise, how much can I enjoy going for a walk or taking the bus to two buses to go to the park? So that kind of information and choices. And the idea is that things are further complicated by the fact that we are kind of social being. And especially in the last talk, we will discuss how subjects make decisions, and especially when it's crucial to learn from the others. For example, these can be relevant if the first part is more relevant for affective disorder in a broader sense, so depression and anxiety. This part, to me, sounds particularly intriguing in personality disorder, and how they make choice and learn about the others. So we know that personality disorder somehow, by definition, has this kind of bias in interpreting the others as helpful or untrustworthy in that sense. So how these can affect decision. Without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker. Just as a rule, I ask if the participant has any question, they can either type it in the chat. There's a they can ask the question there, or otherwise at the end of the talk we will have like 5 minutes briefly to, if you really need to focus on a specific facet of the task, of the experiment and everything. Otherwise, at the end of the 3 talks, we will have around 20 minutes for a more broader discussion. And if you got any idea, question, you can save it for later if you think that the other talks will address those questions. So the first topic, the first speakers is Dr. Erdem Pulcu. That he studied, he did his PhD at the University of Manchester on social and value-based decision-making in depression with Rebecca Elliott. Then he moved quite far east, and he did a postdoc at the Riken Brain Science Institute in Tokyo and the CNET in Osaka on the computational model of decision-making. And a few years ago, 2016, I think, he went back to went back to UK in Oxford, at Oxford University, where he is still now, where he works on reinforcement learning and in general social decision making, social interactions, with the computational psychiatry lab headed by Mike Browning, and with the psychopharmacology and emotion research lab head by Catherine Harmer. Please, Erdem.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. The title of my talk is Misestimation of Uncertainty in Affective Disorders, and today I will talk about reinforcement learning and Bayesian ideal observer models, which can give us the tools to understand how misestimation of uncertainty can give way to affective biases, which are common to psychiatric disorders. I will briefly talk about the clinical relevance and dive into the experimental paradigms and results. And especially for the experimental methods, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me to ask so that the paradigms are understood clear enough. So we can define affective biases as a preferential processing of negative or positive information, and these are common to psychiatric disorders such as major depression in the form of negativity bias. Patients with depression process negative aspects of things as if these are more valuable to make sense of their world, and there is previous evidence to suggest a relationship between affective biases and symptoms of depression. However, mechanisms underlying why some people develop affective biases in the first place is not well known. Today, I will explore these mechanisms across two studies, and I want to briefly introduce these concepts by a toy example. Imagine that you have a habit of buying takeaway coffee from your favorite coffee shop every day, and let's say there are 3 baristas working in this place with some variation in how well they can prepare your order. And let's say one of these baristas is expert who can consistently prepare good quality of coffee, whereas the other 2 are trainees who might need more time. And one day you felt like your coffee wasn't as good as it used to be, and there's a word on the street that the place may undergo a management change. In this context, how do we judge whether attributing the change in the taste of your coffee to the performance of these people, or suspect because it's the management change and the new management is using cheaper quality beans to make the place more profitable? So our everyday life involves resolving these kind of uncertainties while decision making, and this is the kind of concepts that I will explore in the subsequent studies. In the first study, we investigated the effect of sudden environmental changes. More theoretically, we call this the volatility, where the environment changes fundamentally and it produces more information content for the future state of the environment. We explored this mechanism with a reinforcement learning task in which participants were asked to choose between 2 abstract shapes like this. And on each trial, they can get win or losses with some hidden probabilities, and their job was to maximize their monetary earnings as much as possible. So the reward and loss probabilities were generated independently, and we manipulated these probabilities and their volatility schedules across different task blocks. For example, in the first block, we see that both outcomes were volatile, have these unexpected changes without flagging these to the participant. And here, the volatile outcomes become informative because once we learn this association, for example, if we look at the segment here, when the reward probability is 85% associated with shape A, once we learn this association, it tells us something about the future state of the environment. So for the remaining trials within that block, we would be more likely to expect a win in that shape. Whereas in blocks 2 and 3, only one type of outcome was volatile, whereas the other type of outcome was stable. So here the wins are 50%, which means that it wouldn't tell us anything about what would happen in the next trial. So in these kind of environments, we predicted that human learners should prioritize learning from the more informative outcomes. And then we expected participants to change their behaviors when the environment flipped around and the wins become more informative, and then the losses becomes stable and informative. Just to flag up a few features of this task, so the reward and loss probabilities were coupled across the shapes, which means that if one shape gives 80% reward, which means that the other shape will give 20% of rewards, but these were independent, which means that if a participant consistently choose one shape across all trials, they can get a win, they can get a loss, they can get win-loss together, in which case these will cancel each other out. And they would also get an empty shape like that, and they can observe that the other shape had both of the outcomes. So on each trial, participant had the full information from the environment that they can also observe what could have been the better choice for that trial. We analyze this data with various reinforcement learning models, and what we show here is that when the information content is comparable, so when both of the outcomes equally informative in the first block, people learn from them equally, but when in the environment loss outcomes are more informative, participants learn more predominantly from the losses, and when the environment changes, participants learn more from the win outcomes. So this suggests that we can induce these preferential information processing biases even to healthy people by tweaking the contingencies in the environment. And this kind of is in line with our hypothesis that maybe patients with depression interpret negative aspects of things as if these are more valuable to make sense of their world. During this task, we also collected pupilometry from participants by measuring their pupil dilation. And what we showed here is participants' pupil dilates more to the volatile outcomes received across the blocks. And then, interestingly, this signal in pupil dilation, the changes in pupil dilation, also correlated with how well participants can adjust their learning rates from stable to volatile blocks. So the delta between these red bars correlated with the delta between these lines shown in this panel. But we only had this signal for the loss outcomes, but not for the wins. And the reason why this is interesting is usually pupil dilation is thought of as an index of the central norepinephrine firing. And this is interesting from the perspective that there are antidepressant medication which act on this system, for example, reboxetine. And in fact, we are investigating the effect of reboxetine in this task and how it modulates learning behavior as well as pupil dilation. Later on, we extend this idea and propose a theory with which misestimation of uncertainty can explain how affective biases may emerge and pose a vulnerability to depression. And doing that, we drive a sort of inference from how learning behavior should be influenced by different sources of uncertainty in the environment. Initially, I talked about volatility, which is regarded as unexpected uncertainty because it leads to a fundamental change in the environment that cannot be expected by the agent. And it also creates a high information content, so it should be taken into account when adjusting one's behavior. But on the other hand, the environments can also have noisy fluctuations, which are commonly referred to as expected uncertainty. For example, everyday fluctuations in air temperature and the fact that this wouldn't surprise us. So that's why it's called expected uncertainty. However, if the noisy fluctuations in the environment are high, then we should discount this kind of information because it wouldn't tell us anything about the future state of the environment, and we should not be influenced by these kind of events. From this perspective, it's possible that patients with depression may attribute higher information content to uninformative negative outcomes, and therefore an accurate estimation of uncertainty in the environment becomes crucial for healthy affective processing. So when we experience a negative outcome, we need to think about whether it is informative or not before allowing it to dampen our mood. In order to tease apart these different sources of uncertainty, we developed a novel Bayesian ideal observer model, which was based on a previous model developed by Tim Behrens and colleagues in their 2007 Nature Neuroscience paper. And this model is represented here in the schematic diagram, and it has nodes to track the environmental volatility, these white nodes. And we also introduce additional sort of dimension to track environmental noise so that the model can integrate and evaluate different sources of uncertainty in the environment and judge what should be the next outcome in this environment. So if we look at this middle segment of the task environment here, so this is just simulated data, but if we look at this segment, we can see that the environment is relatively stable, with some low fluctuations, some low noisy fluctuations. And in the middle panel, we can see how the model is treating this environment. So it understands that the environment is stable. So in the red line, the volatility estimate is gradually falling down, whereas in the blue lines are the noise estimate, and it remains relatively low and stable throughout that block. However, after a while, the environment now changes, and then it starts to have some noisy fluctuations. And then the model initially thinks that this might be informative, so it thinks that the environment becomes more volatile for a while. But after gathering more evidence from this environment, the model starts to think, okay, this is not volatility, but probably noise. So its volatility estimates are falling down rather sharply, and then noise estimate starts to rise up. So it can separate different sources of uncertainty and evaluate what are the informative events in the environment. We also explored how this model would act if we lesion this model. For example, if the model does not have any volatility dimension, so it can only attribute changes in the environment to the different levels of noise, so on the x-axis here. Whereas if we lesion the model in the noise dimension or the standard deviation dimension, the model can attribute any changes in the environment to volatility. Obviously, this will be mistaken as well, because here, as we see that, for example, in the middle segment, here the environment is noisy, but if the model is noise blind, then it can only think of the changes in volatility, whereas the full model can estimate these across the grid, and it can change its behavior to different sources of uncertainty. In the next study, we investigated these processes in a group of patients with depression, remitted depression, and healthy volunteers. And we had a different task schedule. So this time, again, people choose between two abstract shapes, and they try to bank as much money as possible. But in this task, on each trial, people win or lose some reward amount, depending on the filling inside these bars. So the green amount showing the wins, and the red bars showing the losses. And here in the graphic, we see the volatility and noise schedule of the environment. So this task only had one block. And just as before, in this task too, people could understand what could have been the better option on that trial, because the empty parts after the green and the red filling show the reward and the loss amount inside the unchosen shape. So participants had the full information about the environment again. So when we compared the overall behavior, the total accumulated money, the groups were comparable, and we can argue that from a perspective of psychosocial functioning, this is all that matters. So please take this into account when we interpret the findings in the subsequent slides. Slides are frozen. Okay. One way of analyzing this behavior is to look at how the outcomes in the previous trials influence the choice on the current trial. And when we look at that analysis, we show that previous high magnitude of wins probe participants to stick with their current choice, whereas previous high magnitude losses prompt participants to explore the other option and change their choice on the current trial. In order to compare the groups, we computed these linear slopes of the win and loss influence, and we feed them into a repeated measures ANOVA model. And this did not suggest any significant main effect of group, also in line with the previous monetary results, and may suggest that when we compare the groups for the learning rates, they might also be comparable. In the next set of analysis, this is exactly what we did, and we investigated this the human behavior in this task with using various reinforcement learning models, and each of them referred to a specific hypothesis about how people should perform this task. For example, two learning rate models suggest that people should be learning from win and loss outcomes separately, and then they integrate this information to compute decision values, and they make choices between those options stochastically. On the other hand, one learning rate model suggests that people learn from win and loss amounts at a comparable rate, but they might have also different reward and loss sensitivity parameters to compute decision values. And in fact, it was this latter model which fit the participant data much better than the other models. And when we look at the parameter estimates coming from this model, we see that the learning rates were comparable, but current depression was associated with significantly lower reward and loss sensitivity parameters. And in fact, this understanding is in line with the findings of a recent meta-analysis from Quentin Hoy's lab, in which when they looked at a number of data from different labs looking at signal detection tasks in patients with depression, they suggested that depression is associated with reduced reward sensitivity, but not any abnormalities in learning rates. Normally, in terms of computational psychiatry, this is the end of the story. People try to fit a model and then show how the model parameters are different between the groups. But in this work, we did something novel and interesting. So the schematic Bayesian model that I previously talked about had parameters which can adjust this precision with which it can track the environmental volatility and noise. So you can think of this model operating on numerical grids, and when the grid sizes become larger, obviously it would have a bearing on the computational efficiency of the model, that it runs much slower to analyze the data, but at the same time, it can extract much precise estimates of the environment as well as predicting the outcome means. So we fitted that model to participant choice behavior, tweaking the parameter to adjust those grids until it maximizes the predictive accuracy of participant choice, such that we can infer what kind of parameters participants must be using to track environmental uncertainty while they are performing that task. So when this approach would help us to understand whether the reward and loss sensitivity impairments that we observed in the current depression group can be attributable to a misestimation of environmental uncertainty. Overall, across these graphics, what we see is that people track volatility with higher precision than noise. And within volatility dimension, the wind volatility is tracked much higher than loss volatility. But when we plug in all of this data into a complex repeated measures ANOVA model with the mean predictive accuracy of the model as a covariate, because it was almost statistically significantly different between the groups, the Bayesian model was able to predict the behavior of the remitted group much better than the other groups, but still overall predictive accuracy was very high. So when we use this as a covariate in a repeated measures ANOVA model, we did not have a main effect of group or any interaction with uncertainty or valence by group. So this seems to indicate that although we demonstrate that depression is associated with reward and loss sensitivity differences compared with remitted patients and healthy volunteers, these differences we cannot attribute to any misestimation of uncertainty. So the overarching summary coming out of these studies is that some aspects of human learning adhere to normative assumptions. For example, the volatility effect in the first study that we demonstrated that we can tweak human learning behavior by adjusting the contingencies in the environment. And in that study, we showed a role for the central norepinephrine system during adaptive learning, as indicated by measuring pupil dilation. This system is shown to be more responsive to the content of negative events happening alongside positive events. So this negative selectivity is important because we only had the correlation for the negative events, and it might have a bearing on understanding antidepressant action which act on the central norepinephrine system. In the second study, we showed that current depression is associated with reward and loss sensitivity impairments during adaptive learning. However, we did not associate this behavioral marker by any misestimation of uncertainty. Thank you very much for listening, and I would like to take your questions.
Thank you, Erdem.
Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. So basically, like the idea is that what you said, that norepinephrine, like through the pupilometry, you tracked the adaptive learning just from punishment, like from negative valence.
Yeah.
Okay. But in the other talk, you instead said that a recent meta-analysis showed that in depression, you don't have an impairment in learning from reward, but
yes,
in the value of reward. So I can learn, like if I'm a depressed subject and you give me some sweets, and I learn when you give me sweets or like a rewarding stimulus. But it's because I value less the rewarding stimulus.
Yeah.
Like, do you know if there's something on the other side? Like, how depressed subject value the negative stimulus? Or do you think that regarding the negative stimulus, is that because they learn more or they value less even the negative stimulus? Like I'm generally flattened and I don't enjoy things, but I don't even care for negative stimulus as well.
So the second task addresses that question to a degree, but I have to highlight that this task only had a single block, and we did not sort of manipulate all possible volatility and noise combinations. So this was relatively a shorter task coming from another study that we did in which this task had 6 blocks. But when we think about the human behavior, so our model-based analysis seems to suggest that people actually learn from win and losses at a comparable rate. So in terms of the learning process, because both of these happen together in these environments, so a single learning rate model fitting the data better seems to suggest that people sort of extract information from both valences at an equal rate. But both the reward and the loss sensitivity parameters were lower in patients with depression, which seems to suggest that these will have a sort of less influence on the computed decision values, which we feed into a sigmoid model. So that partially responds to this question, but again, this task has a limited sort of space that we modulated this behavior, so a little bit less rigorous than the first task, where we manipulated both the volatility and noise, both the volatility of different outcomes. And in that work, actually, we had a strong correlation with that negative learning rate with trait anxiety, but that group wasn't recruited on the basis of that measure. So it was interesting that it came up as significant as Mike Brown's previous work, but we have a ongoing study in which we investigate this more rigorously in a group of patients with depression.
Thank you. I need to look better at the results, because what's really fascinating of this design is that you included both, if I got it right, both subject with an actual depressive episode and subject at the end of the depressive episode.
Yes.
So like that can be crucial in understanding if what come first, like if there are difference between these two groups, is like might tell you why a depressive episode starts in the first place. Like
yes, and also maybe I didn't tell you too much about the clinical features, but the current depression group also was medication free, and the remitted depression group as well. So both of the depression groups were medication free.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions about these two studies? Thoughts about uncertainty?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Maybe this is what you did, Erdem, and I missed it, but did you try models with sort of where the learning rate itself adapts?
Self-adapt meaning like a variable learning rate? Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe this is what you did and I missed it, but did you try models where the learning rate itself adapts to like the size of the prediction error, like Pierce Hall and things, you know, as an example?
Actually, I am investigating a Pierce Hall kind of model in another context, but we did not fit that kind of model to this data, and I agree because that kind of exploration led me to think there should be a nonlinear relationship between learning rates and prediction errors. And actually, although in this model-free analysis we computed these slopes as linear, one can also see that the influence of outcome magnitudes are nonlinear in that respect. But this is something we definitely can do, but we haven't done. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like it might be interesting to look with that sort of task where the volatility is changing and stuff. It could be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other question? If not, I can't see in the chat anything in the chat, so we can move on. Thank you again, Erdem.
You're welcome. I will stop my screen sharing. Stop sharing screen.
Okay, and I will introduce the next speakers. It is Dr. Neil Garrett. He did his master and then PhD at UCL with the Affective Brain Lab, supervised by Tali Sharot, where he explored the effect of valence in belief updating. After that, he moved to US, Princeton specifically, at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute under the supervision of Nathaniel Doe, where he did his first postdoc there, and he explored how does work belief updating in foraging decision. And now recently he became a Sir Harry Wellcome Research Fellow, and he moved back to UK now in Oxford, where he's working with two groups pretty important in decision making, and is the group of Matthew Rushworth and Chris Sommerfeld. And he's going to tell us about how keeping track and the environmental evaluation in human decision making. Please, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes, yes.
Great. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to tell you about a couple of tasks in this talk, which hopefully will be interesting for you, and it will overlap with some of the themes from the interesting talk we heard before from Erdem. And so the first bit is all about how we think about our environment and how rewarding it is. So often when we think of how we assign value to different options in our environment, like these two options here, we think of, trying each one out a few times, getting some outcomes, and then over time, the value of these options sort of starts to converge towards the average outcome over time. But this is a very sort of local way of learning. It doesn't take into account things like how frequent do we see each option. So you might have an environment like this, a rich environment in which the high value option is much more common than the low value options. Or you might have a poor environment like this, where the low value options outweigh the high value options. And so by sort of thinking about frequency which you see which options, as well as what their value is, we can form a global estimate of how rewarding our environment is, and potentially that can then feed back into how rewarding we find each individual option. So to give you a concrete example, it might make sense if you're in this poor environment here to assign a higher value to option A, because if you wait for the option B to come along, you might be waiting for a really, really long time. So that's the, and there's lots of real life examples of this. So you can think of the job market, for example. If you're getting loads of fantastic job offers come along, then you can form an estimate over time that you're in a really rich environment. And as a consequence of that, you can afford to be really selective about what job opportunities you pursue. Alternatively, you might have rejection, we'll call you sort of thing. In that situation, you form an estimate that you're in a poor environment, and there you should accept options that you might have rejected in the rich environment. So what I'm going to try and show you today is some evidence of how people form and update estimates of their environment. I'm going to show you how individuals might track global changes in their environmental quality. And I'm going to argue that asymmetric learning can account for quicker adjustments when you transition from a poor to a rich environment compared to when you go from a rich to a poor environment. Then in the second part, I'm going to look at how belief updating might be changed under threat. And I'm going to show some evidence that sensitivity to negative information can be enhanced under threat, and that can attenuate learning asymmetries. And at the end, I'll propose a sort of theoretical framework by which it might be possible that asymmetric learning in response to autonomic responses can sort of govern the degree of bias that we show in each environment. Okay, So foraging decisions seem to be a really good place. So the idea of foraging decisions is that you have one concrete option in front of you. So this might be like the option to go out on a date or the option to get a job. And you have to weigh how good that option is in front of you against a background estimate of how rewarding your environment is. And there's like a well-known theory that actually comes from economics of how you might be able to do that. So in a task that we've looked at to examine this, the way it goes about, so this was done online. Individuals are flying a spaceship through space, and as they go along, they see different options come at them to different windows, and they just need to decide whether they want to spend some time capturing points that option can give them, or rejecting the option and seeing what else comes along. So it's a very simple task, and in total there are 4 different options here, and they range from the good to the bad. So this option here is really good because it gives you a lot of points and you don't need to invest very much time in the game to get those points. These 2 are in between. They either give you high points but require a lot of time, or they give you a very small amount of points but don't require very much time. And this option here is the worst because it doesn't give you very many points and you need to invest a lot of time to get it. And if individuals are optimal, how would this look? So what we do is we have 2 different environments in which they fly this spaceship, they play this game. We have a rich environment where the best option is much more frequent than the other 3 options. And in that environment, what you should do is you should really just select the best option and reject these other 3 that come along. That's the way you will earn the most money and points in this game. In the poor environment, however, the worst option is much more common than the other 3 options. So in that environment, you should now accept all these 3 options and only reject the worst option in order to maximize your earnings. If we look at how participants actually perform, they're not exactly optimal, but they do show this big change in their acceptance rates between the environments. So when they're in this poor environment, those 2 middle options that I showed you, they accept those at around 75% of a rate. But when they're in a rich environment, that drops down to about 50%. So they really do seem sensitive to this manipulation, how rewarding each environment is that they experience. We can also look trial to trial at what the effects are. And what I'm plotting here is on the x-axis, you've got what option did the participants see on the previous trial. On the y-axis, I'm going to show you whether they accept the next option that comes along. And what you see is a gradual increase, which is, again, is consistent with optimal behavior and foraging problems. So if the worst option comes along, that's a little bit of evidence that your environment has got worse, and therefore you should be less selective on the next trial and accept whatever comes. That's what people seem to do. If the best option comes along, that's a bit of evidence that your environment's got better. Therefore, you can afford to be more selective on the next trial. Okay, but that's not the full story. So importantly in this task, participants could experience these 2 environments in either order. They could either begin in the rich environment where everything's wonderful and then transition to this poor environment, or they could begin in the poor environment and then halfway through transition to this richer environment. And what was quite striking is we saw this very different behavior depending on what order they'd experienced the environment. So what we found is that if they begin in the rich environment and then go into the poor environment, they tend to change their acceptance rates a little bit, but not that much. Whereas if they began in the poor environment and then went to the rich environment, there's a much bigger change in acceptance rates. And this was an effect that replicated in a second experiment that we ran. Okay, so we have a computational model that tries to estimate how individuals might be tracking the reward rate in this task and using this to decide whether they want to accept or reject each option. Basically, the way it works is that you have a reward rate, and that updates each second individuals experience this game according to whether that second gives them a reward or gives them nothing. And importantly, we have 2 models. We have one model, which I'm calling here the MVT model, where there's just a single learning rate. So whether you get a reward or you get nothing in a second, that reward rate estimate has to shift up and down at a similar rate. And I'm going to test that against a second model, which I'm calling here the asymmetry model. And the only difference in this model is that there are now 2 learning rates. One for positive cases, so that's the case where you get some kind of positive reward, and one for negative cases where seconds go by and you don't get anything. So that potentially allows this reward rate to adjust differently depending on whether the environment gets better or it gets worse. Okay. And what we find is that this asymmetry model, the one with 2 learning rates, does a lot better than the MVT model, the one with just 1 learning rate, and that replicated in the second experiment we did as well. And you can see here, what I'm plotting in this plot here is the difference in the learning rates in this asymmetry model, so the difference between the positive learning rate and the negative learning rate. And I'm showing you that I plotted against the degree of model improvement that you get between the MVT model and the asymmetry model. And one thing to note here is that nearly all the data points are in this upper right-hand quadrant here. What that means is that for the vast majority of participants, the learning rate for positive is much greater than the learning rate for negative. And the greater that difference is, the more of a model improvement you get for this asymmetry model compared to the MVT model. Okay. What this plot is doing is giving you intuition for then what effect those asymmetric learning rates have on the reward rate in the different environments. So what I'm plotting here is the reward rate estimate from this asymmetry model, plotted out for the 2 groups of participants, those that had rich environment followed by poor, and those that had poor followed by rich. And you see that if you begin in the poor environment and then go into the rich environment, the reward rate goes from being quite low here to very high when you're in the rich environment. But when you're in a rich environment and go into the poor environment, the reward rate drops, but not by very, very much. And that's because the learning rate for positive is greater than for negative, so that when you start getting this negative information in the poor environment, these poor options coming along, you're very slow to bring that reward rate back down to the correct level. And if we simulate what choices are under this asymmetric model, we find that we are able to recover this difference in change in acceptance rates you get depending on which environments you start in and which environments you finish in. So the blue dots here are results from simulations from the asymmetric model. You see, again, you get a small change in acceptance rates if you begin in the rich environment and end in the poor environment, and a big change if you begin in the poor environment and go to the rich environment. The MVT model does predict a change in acceptance rates between the 2 environments, but it doesn't predict that you'd get a greater change in acceptance rates for one case or the other case. Okay, so I think this is really interesting because there's lots of other studies that have been done that have shown the presence of asymmetric learning. Chris, actually, who's going to be speaking next, has done some work with Talia on this as well, showing that when we think about beliefs about the future, often we learn better from positive information compared to negative information. But they've also now shown that in other tasks as well, like simple bandit tasks as well. So people like Stefano Palminteri have done a lot of work in this area. Okay, so hopefully I've shown you some evidence that asymmetric learning can account for quicker adjustments when transitioning from poor to rich than rich to poor in foraging type of contexts. The next thing we're going to look at is how belief updating, and particularly this asymmetric learning idea, might be altered under threat. And the basic perspective here, and this relates nicely to Erdem's talk, is that stress and autonomic systems can be good for tracking and adjusting to overall environmental characteristics. So this is a study by Yan Li and Nathaniel Dorr from about 10 years ago now. And what you find here is that the learning rate, so this is actually using a Peirce-Hall model, which is a model where the learning rate is able to adjust depending on how big the prediction errors are on a trial-to-trial basis. That seems to really closely be tracked by skin conductance responses, suggesting that indeed all these autonomic systems, things like pupil dilation, skin conductance, might be adjusting to some overall characteristic of what the environment's doing. So to look at how asymmetric learning might be adjusting to what the environment's doing, we ran participants in a study. This was done in London when I was a PhD student, with a belief updating task, which some of you might know, but I'll just explain it very quickly. So the premise of this task is that individuals see lots of negative life events. They're all negative, unpleasant events that you never want to have happen to you in the future. Things like kidney stones, domestic burglary. And for each event they see, they're asked to estimate what's the likelihood of that happening to them in the future. And then they're shown what the actual average likelihood of that event happening to them is. So this person thinks they've got a 30% chance of getting kidney stones, and they're told actually the average for someone like you is 13%. Then in a second session, they're again asked to estimate how likely they think that event is to happen to them. So we can compare their first estimate to their second estimate after they've been given this information to see how much they change their beliefs following this information. And we can also separate events that they see into good news and bad news trials. So good news trials would be where the average is lower than their initial estimate, and bad news trials would be where the information presented is higher than their initial estimate. And we can see how much learning changes for these two types of trials. And the basic idea is, again, just like in the foraging task I showed you, is we're going to be able to try and operationalize learning as a correspondence between estimation errors, which is this difference between their first estimate and the information they see, and the degree of change in their beliefs. So the basic idea here is that when you have a really big estimation error, so when the information you're giving really divulges from your first estimate, then you should have a big change in your beliefs if there's a close correspondence. If it's not really tracking it very well, then there shouldn't be much of a relationship. Okay. And so when we did this study, we divided participants into two groups. One was put into a threat manipulation group. So they were told that after the experiment, they'd have to do this horrible talk to an audience of academics that they wouldn't be able to prepare for. And that was really effective at increasing their threat levels. So you see here, this is increase in self-report. This is change in skin conductance levels. They were all increased relative to the control group. So this is just saying that our threat manipulation was successful in creating sort of anxiety in people. And then they did this belief updating task. And what we find is that in the control group, who were not stressed out, we again find this evidence of asymmetric learning. So they learned much more from positive information than they did to negative information. This is a finding that's been replicated in lots of other studies like this using this task. In the threat manipulation group, however, we found that they were just as able to learn from good news that they got, but they were now more responsive to bad news that they got. So their learning from bad news was enhanced if they're under threat in this study. And the extent to which their threat levels increased seemed to really correlate with the degree to which they learned from bad news specifically. You don't find this relationship when you look at this correlation for good news. And so the final thing then we wanted to do is then try and replicate this in a real life data sample. So we went to firefighters in the state of Colorado, and whilst they're sitting at a station waiting to go out and fight these fires, they're able to do this task because they're actually at the station for quite a long time. And what we found there is, again, a similar sort of relationship. So the more threatened these firefighters felt whilst they were waiting to go and fight fires, the higher their sensitivity, their learning from bad news information. And here in this study, which we didn't find in the study before, we also found a bit of a trend in the other direction for good news. It seemed like the more threatened they were, the less they responded to good news as well. Okay, so the potential theoretical framework I want to suggest that's suggested by these studies is that when we experience a threat in our environment, a global threat like a fire, this generates a number of physiological responses, so things like pupil dilation, skin conductance, heart beating faster, and this influences our sensitivity to good news and bad news. In particular, it seems to enhance our sensitivity to bad news, and that has an effect in terms of influencing our estimate of our environment's rate of reward. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but just to say, to sort of give you a bit of evidence that's consistent with that framework that I've proposed, we've also run the same foraging task that I showed you at the beginning in Santa Barbara on the West Coast in California. And when individuals did this task, that we also took trial by trial measures of their heart respiration rate. And we found that the same order effect in this experiment. So again, if you began in a poor environment and went to the rich environment, you would change your acceptance rates much more than if it was the other way around. Again, this asymmetry model with two learning rates seems to account for the data better than this model with a single learning rate. But now what we also looked at is we looked at a new model in which we allowed this learning rate to adjust, to adapt, depending on whether the heart rate was high or low on each trial. We found that this didn't improve the model fit for positive information. So whether you had a fast heartbeat or a non-fast heartbeat, a slow heartbeat rather, This didn't seem to modulate the learning from positive information in this foraging task, but we did find an improvement for negative information. And when we unpacked what the direction of that was, we found that the learning asymmetry was much higher when your heart was suggesting you were under low arousal. When you're under high arousal, this learning asymmetry became closer together. In other words, there was a sort of bias towards positive information under low arousal, which was attenuated when you're under high arousal. Very similar to the threat study that I showed you with the belief updating task. Okay, so I think this was interesting because it sort of gives us an idea of how our decisions might be influenced by these different sensitivities to negative and positive information. And particularly, a decision that comes out of the foraging framework is whether I should exploit or explore my environment. But also I might apply to other things like, is this worth the effort or not? So relating to motivation. And the basic idea is that a low reward rate might mean that the opportunity cost of not acting is lower. And that might give rise to a number of symptoms you see in depression, like apathy and anagia and things like that. And certainly that's consistent with what I found in the past with the belief updating task. I found there that the higher individuals' depression symptoms are, the more responsive they seem to be to negative information. You don't find that same relationship for positive information. So it'll be very interesting to test whether you find this same kind of correlations in the context of foraging tasks, where what's being thought about is the reward rate of your environment. And also, so Paolo and myself had a paper come out last year looking at how belief updating and learning asymmetries in this belief updating task relates to bipolar disorder. It would also be interesting, I think, to explore that in the context of foraging tasks. And Paolo is also currently running the foraging task, and we're thinking about how it might relate to addiction as well. So we're looking forward to seeing the results there. Okay, so I'll end there. I just want to thank you, Nathaniel and Tali, who are the two supervisors for the main two studies I introduced, and my collaborators on the work as well. And thank you for listening as well, and for the invitation once again.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I would. That's interesting, and yeah, I'm quite. As much as you, I just want to know what happened in substance abuse, and I was thinking now to bipolar disorder, to the foraging task in bipolar disorder, because as you mentioned, we look at the belief updating, and did that predicted the course of the disorder. But I was thinking that what about if coming from like having a depressive episode and then a manic episode can parallel the going from poor to rich environment, and coming from a manic episode to depressive episode can parallel coming from a good environment to a poor environment, and if these might actually affect the course of illness, like because overall patients are somehow respect the kind of cycle. They like, if they go, it's likely that if they have manic depressive, they will keep this kind of waving in the future. And I was thinking, like, have you thought if like the poor, rich and poor environment might explain how people get into the depressive episode and get out of the depressive episode? Isn't getting out from a depressive episode nothing that coming from a poor to a rich environment? And so probably, does it make sense to you that antidepressant might actually act in fostering the learning from, as if in the depressed patient that goes out from the depressive episode is actually learning more because of that's the target of the antidepressant.
So are you asking, could this be a mechanism by which antidepressants work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it could be, yeah, potentially, that, maybe, they boost your responsivity to positive information, perhaps, or reduce your responsiveness to negative information, perhaps. therefore your reward rate increases, and therefore you're more motivated to go out there and explore the world and do things and that sort of thing.
You're not aware of someone who tried, like Erdem did in the depressed patient and at the remission of the episode, or longitudinally? Not
with foraging stuff, I don't think. No, I haven't seen that. That'd be interesting to look at.
And again, sorry, but what in that hypothesis, what do you think about the kind of learning effect? Because you tried, the groups were randomized in coming from poor to rich or rich to poor. Like, do you think that there's an effect of time? What do you think that patient can repeat the task and would be reliable repeating the task, like at the end of the episode?
It's a good question. Well, I guess one thing to say about that is, like, it would be interesting to do a version of this task, even in healthy people, where you have each environment many, many times, like 10 times or something, because you'd imagine. So what's sort of key? What's fundamental for this model to work in terms of picking up the difference in the behavioral effects is that the reward rate sort of carries over between the two environments. So if you start in a rich environment, then you're still relying on that same reward rate, and it's got to slowly come down for you to sort of change your behavioral choices. But you'd imagine that if you had like these environments continuously interleaved with each other, at some point you're just going to have one reward rate for the poor environment and one for the rich environment, right? It's not going to be one that exists for all of the environments. You're going to just probably restate a reward rate. If you've seen the rich environment 6 times, you're just going to reinstate the reward rate that you had last time that you were in the rich environment, right? And I think that is an interesting idea. Like, what are the circumstances by which we sort of contexts are effectively sort of blended together? So we're relying on like one global estimate throughout everything. What are the situations in which we sort of pass up the space a lot more and then start sort of saying, okay, this is one environment, so I'm going to rely on this higher reward rate here, and this is this type of environment, so I'm going to rely on this type of reward rate here. That'll be interesting to think about.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any ideas? Whatever. If not, we are a couple of minutes earlier. We can move on with the next talk. Thank you, Neil, again. And I asked Christoph, that is somewhere. Christoph Korn is the next speaker, and as I told you, he will talk about multi-step decision making and social learning. He will introduce the social bit. He did his PhD at the Freie Universität in Berlin with the funding of the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. And he, as Neil already mentioned, he did this joint master at UCL with Tali Sharad, where he studied belief updating and between UCL and École Normale Supérieure. Then he moved to, it's a bit, just a lot of places, so I might get it wrong, but then he moved to Zurich, where he worked with Dominic Bach. And eventually he's been awarded the Emmy Noether Research Group, and he founded his own lab called Decision Neuroscience of Human Interaction in Hamburg first, where he worked with Jan Glescher. And now, really recently, and congratulations, Christoph, he got a tenure-track professorship at the University of Heidelberg, where he moved this year, and where he continues studying the human cooperation in a multimodal approach. Please, Christoph.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you see my screen and can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see your slides.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And I have the huge advantage that Erdem and Neil have already introduced many of the concepts that I'm going to talk about, so that is quite nice. I will focus on multi-step decision making, also a little bit show you on what we've been doing on social learning. So let's start with the multi-step decision making. So I'm going to introduce to you a different type of foraging task. It's different from the one that Neil showed. And the first difference, I guess, is that superficially, Neil used these futuristic, fancy spaceships, and we have this kind of prehistoric, kind of classic foraging setting for humans, basically hunting for food. But I'll show you some kind of more conceptual differences in a bit. And the idea is to understand biases and deviations from rational and optimal criteria. And for this, I think it's often useful to think of, to devise neurocomputational models that have, according to Ma, these three layers, where on the highest layer you have the goals of a person in a given environment that you specify. On the next level, you have the algorithms, so the mathematical models that help you to understand what's going on. And then on the implementational layer, we use neuroimaging to understand what's going on in the brain in basically human body, also psychophysics, as Neil and Erdem have shown before. And the hope is so that this kind of combined outlook and framework will help us understand psychiatric diseases, and that's kind of the goal of the group in the future. So I'm not going to show you data on this today, but I'm kind of really looking forward to getting maybe some inputs of how you think of what I'm going to show you will help inform research on affective and personality disorders. Okay, so now let's go to this specific homeostatic foraging task that we're looking into. So on the level of the computations, we're interested in how people minimize threats during this foraging situation. On the algorithmic level, we're looking into decision trees, where we have optimal and heuristic policies. And I'm going to show you how these decision trees look like. And this should maybe introduce to you this kind of right away. This is actually where the task that I'm going to show you differs from what Neil showed you, because here people don't have to learn anything, they're informed about everything. And then on the implementational level, we hypothesize that the medial prefrontal cortex kind of relevant for computing what could happen in these decision trees, and that the hippocampus and the amygdala might be involved in some arbitration, some approach avoidance conflicts that can happen when you have to make these decisions. Okay, so first of all, how do these decision trees look like? So we have an agent, a hunter-gatherer, with a certain energy, and the important bit is that the energy shouldn't go to zero, because then you die. So there's a kind of clear-cut a criterion or goal, avoiding starvation or avoiding death in general. And then to do so, the environment where the participant can go hunting or foraging, where in here the green parts will give you the probability of getting the gain, and the red parts of not getting it. And then, as so often in life, it's easier to get smaller rewards. So the smaller reward has a higher probability than the larger reward, which has a lower probability. And this is kind of a general setup that participants are introduced to. And the important bit is, you want to avoid starving today, but you also need to make sure that you don't starve tomorrow. So you have to think about the future. And it's kind of this decision tree that unfolds here, where the different choices can lead to different outcomes. And then you need to make sure that across this whole decision tree, you're taking the optimal decision now, that kind of the decision now incorporates the future. And as you might know from chess or other games, so it's kind of difficult to think about the future, even if you know all the rules that are at play. And then in more complicated cases, which I'm not going to address here, it's basically what Neil introduced, that you also have to learn about the environment, so you are unsure about the environment. Here we also had a rich and poor environment, where in the rich environment the probabilities were higher for gaining something than in the poor environment, and these fluctuated, but as I said, participants were informed. And when they make their decision, there's also the choice to stay at home, basically, and accept a sure with smaller loss. And participants have to make multiple decisions within a given framework, and then the framework will switch. And to understand that on the algorithmic side, we use what's called a Markov decision process. And in this Markov decision process, these energy states are translated into actual states. These incorporate, so they're different for rich and poor environments and different for the different levels. And this zero state here is the one that you should avoid. So that would be the state where you're death, and death is kind of naturally absorbing, so you can't get out of that state. And when participants make a decision, they have this waiting decision, so staying at home, which leads to a sure, small loss, or kind of just moving one energy state down. On the other hand, foraging is probabilistic, so it can lead to a gain, so kind of moving up with a probability p, and moving up can have across different states. So sometimes, in some cases, they can move up 2 states and sometimes just 1 state, so that differs. And then when they are not successful with the foraging, then they move down 2 steps. So that's important, that the foraging has this potential outcome that is worse than just waiting. And when we set up this Markov decision process, we can then use it to calculate the optimal policy for a given environment. So we have this kind of optimality benchmark, and we can then compare participants' behavior to that optimal benchmark. So we ask the question, so which decision policies do healthy persons use to minimize threats, so this threat of starvation in such a game? And do these optimal or these decision policies link to the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a region commonly involved in many types of decision making, also in thinking about the future? Okay, so this is basically how the task looked like. So in the choice phase, participants were presented with the probabilities and the magnitudes they could forage, and then with the weighting option, they saw their current energy state. And then they would get the outcome, and they played this for multiple rounds, a kind of mini block. And as I said, participants were informed about everything that could happen in a given mini block, and we called the mini block forest. So they were in this forest, they knew everything that could happen. And just to repeat that again, that's basically where one point where this task differs from the task that Neil introduced. Okay, so how does behavior look like in this task? So what I'm plotting you here is on the x-axis the probability of foraging success, which varied across different trials, and on the y-axis the probability of foraging, and these dots here show the averages across participants for these given choices or like setups here. And then we had a number of models, and we compared how well these models fit to participants' data. And what you can see here is that this one model here, which is the probability of foraging success, best described participants' behavior. So it's simply saying that participants foraged more when the probability of foraging success was high and foraged less when it was lower. And this is a heuristic policy. It's heuristic in the sense that it doesn't take care of the future. So you just, in your current state, you see the probability that you're going, with which you're going to get something, and you're using that as your decision variable. This heuristic doesn't care about the future, so about the next steps that are going to happen. But we still found that this optimal policy, which takes into account future time steps in this optimal fashion, as described by this Markov decision process and the kind of idealized situation, a very controlled situation that we put participants in, this optimal policy explains variance in behavior on top of this simple heuristic. And here on the y-axis you have then the optimal policy and this horizon of 5 time steps ahead. This optimal policy, if it's high, so if it indicates that you should forage, participants do it. If you don't, if it indicates that you should wait, participants wait more. So we have this combination of a heuristic policy and an optimal policy that participants are using in this task. And actually today, one of the PhD students in the group came, showed me some new results with a new heuristic that kind of has an intermediate level. And in the new data she has, this seems to perform better than the optimal policy. I've been so curious to check how this looks in this older data, or whether we can get some policies in between that could describe human behavior even better. So I mean, that's in general, I guess, one issue with these computational models, that you can always devise new models and you might miss out on the true model that best describes. But I mean, that's also the beauty of it. So you can kind of go back and compare new models against the data that against the older ones that you've tested. So curious to see how this will look like. Okay, but so for the moment, I would say it's a clear indication that participants use this optimal policy, and in the fMRI data, we find that this optimal policy is linked to activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. So let's say some kind of classic regions involved in decision making. And what I find interesting as well is that the uncertainty associated with this optimal policy is also linked to more dorsal regions within the medial prefrontal cortex. So it seems that participants are also tracking how certain, how indicative the optimal policy is at a given time point. So based on that, we designed a kind of slight variation of the task that I've introduced to you to ask how participants address approach avoidance conflicts, because approach avoidance conflicts have been kind of a centerpiece of many studies in looking in animals and also in humans into psychiatric disorders. So, and these studies have linked approach avoidance conflicts to activity, especially in the hippocampus and also in the amygdala. Okay, so what do I mean by approach avoidance conflict? Actually quite simple. So in our task, so on the one hand, you want to avoid a wolf attacking you, and that's actually how we framed it for participants. On the other hand, you want to approach the fruits or the food. So often in real life situations, we have this kind of conflict between getting something valuable, but also avoiding something that is problematic. And so here, participants are tasked to avoid starvation on the one hand, but also predation on the other hand. And the nice thing about this Markov decision process is that we can just quite simply actually make this a bit more complicated and add these errors here that basically incorporate the wolf. So foraging now can lead to different outcomes. On the one hand, we still have a probability of gaining something, probability of just being unsuccessful, and that would be without being attacked by the wolf. But then the way we set it up was that in some cases also the wolf can attack, and if the wolf attacks, then you basically die immediately. So this is the Markov decision process incorporating this approach avoidance conflicts that we used. And so the tasks look quite similar, the difference is that now this wolf is added here, and again, the information how probable the wolf is kind of given to participants, so they don't need to learn anything about the wolf. They know all the probabilities. And then there's the outcome, in that case the wolf attacked, and again the participants kind of have these mini blocks, these forests, and at the beginning of each mini block they are informed about the rich and the poor environments and things that can happen. And maybe to say this here again, this information here helps you to know about the future. So one kind of thought would be that, okay, if the environment is currently quite risky, you might want to wait so that you can then on the next trial maybe be in the richer environment, and in that sense you're taking into account the future at this moment, and that's something that this Markov decision process captures kind of in this optimal way. Okay, so here again, how does the behavior look like? We find now that the best decision variable is the probability of this predator, of this wolf attacking. So we have that here on the x-axis. So the more likely the predator is to attack, the less likely participants are to forage. And again, this is heuristic because it doesn't take into account the next time state, just the current state. And but again, participants' behavior is additionally explained by the optimal policy. So we again have this combination of a heuristic policy and an optimal policy. And then in accordance with our hypothesis, we find that this probability of the predator attacking is actually related to this cluster. It's kind of both encompasses amygdala and hippocampus. And interestingly, again, we find that the choice uncertainty of this heuristic in that case is tracked in the human brain and is related to the same region, also to the hippocampus and the amygdala. Okay, so to sum this up, we have investigated this multi-step decisions in the framework of these homeostatic foraging tasks, and we find that participants are able to minimize these threats. They seem to be able to compute in some ways the decision tree, and this is implemented in prefrontal cortex and hippocampus and amygdala. And then in the near future, or we're actually currently doing that, we're extending this to social homeostatic decisions, where people now kind of have to forage together and have to rely on each other. So that entails some theory of mind. So you need to know at a given time point what the other persons are doing, if they're competing with you or if they're cooperating. So we're looking into this framework in a wider sense. And in terms of understanding affective and also personality disorders, I think on the one hand we can dissociate different lines of process that involved and might go awry in these disorders. So on the one hand we have the risky decision making, which could just be different on a very basic level. Then the approach avoidant conflicts could be tackled in a very different way. And then one problem that patients might have quite often is kind of this planning, this kind of computation of the future and setting about what's going to happen. And this might be especially relevant in this social context, as I mentioned just before. So any thoughts and ideas about this process, what you would find interesting would be very welcome. Okay, and then, yeah, so that's the idea of linking it to real life. And then for the last few minutes, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and tell you about a different task that is now about social learning. So where two people meet each other, and then like in that case here, the blue person has some ideas about the green person, and the green person gives some feedback. So this is now about learning in a social context, in the sense of learning about another person, about their traits and also about their preferences. So together with a collaborator, we have already done some work on learning about preferences, but here I'm going to show you a learning about traits such as the trait of being generous, cooperative, or helpful. And for this, we're making use of reinforcement learning algorithm as Neil and Erdem have presented to them. And we wanted to first see, can reinforcement learning be harnessed in some way to understand what's going on when you learn about another person? And in a way, how is the conceptual knowledge that we have about these different traits incorporated in reinforcement learning? How can we do this? And this is how the task looked like. So participants saw just got different, so basically, sorry, were asked different questions. So in sequence, so first question is kind of how generous is Tim? And they haven't met him, they're never going to meet him. It's just kind of some person you don't know at all. So in the beginning, your estimate might be quite random, and then you get the feedback. What did Tim say about himself? That's in green here. So Tim in that case says he's quite generous, so he's a 5. And then participants would be presented with a new trait that they had to estimate about him. And so this goes on for about 60 traits in most the studies we're doing. And on the one hand, participants can use some prior knowledge. So they could just extrapolate from their own self-ratings. So just say everybody's a bit like me in the same way, maybe it was, but that's one way of approaching that. Or participants might have some conceptual ideas how the general populations, like how people are on average, and use that to say or to estimate how Tim is like, without actually learning anything about Tim during the course of the experiment. And this could be done using reinforcement learning. So in that sense, participants might kind of say experience or track a prediction error. So the difference between what they said about Tim and what Tim said about himself, and use that to update their estimate. And from these models, we can have a different combination. So on the one hand, here we have the self-rating or population rating mean, which could just be a basic no learning models. And then you have the reinforcement learning, which is, of course, a learning model, and then you combine them in different ways. And on top of that, we have a new model, which I think is the most interesting bit here. So in this model, we have reinforcement learning, but we additionally have the similarity here. So we're basically putting into the model a matrix of how similar these traits are to each other. So this is kind of just a snapshot of 4 traits, but we have them for the full trait space. So it's showing you here that helpful and generous, these are kind of, let's say, rather similar traits. So they have a high correlation with each other, whereas helpful is not so much related to being tidy or diligent, whereas on the other hand, being tidy is related to being diligent. So this is basically capturing the big 5 in a more fine-grained way. And this can easily be incorporated in the reinforcement learning. So what this model is saying is that when you see a prediction error for your estimate of whether Tim is helpful, you automatically kind of apply that to all the other traits, even the traits you don't know they're not kind of coming, you don't know whether they will come up also, but you kind of immediately generalize according to this similarity model. So that's the similarity between the traits. So that's what this model is basically saying. And now I've talked a lot about the model. So basically, it seems to be the best model in across the multiple studies that we've done. I'm just showing you one example here. So it's better than the no learning models and better than simple reinforcement learning models. And on top of that, it's also optimal in the sense when we simulate data. So basically, how would the model solve the task of learning about Tim? And we have these different models. Then this is also the best model in learning about Tim. I mean, that being said, this model gets the input about in the form of this similarity matrix. Yeah, this is just saying we've done a couple of studies, or even some more, and the data shows that people seem to combine reinforcement learning and their knowledge about this conceptual trait space, and at least in the simple tasks that we've devised, this is also the optimal model of how you should learn about other people. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you for your interest, and I'd like to thank my former supervisors and the wonderful PhD students in the group for doing this work. Okay, looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Christoph. If we all want to unmute ourselves and just give a round of applause to all the speakers today. And thank you. Thank you, Christoph. Can you hear me? Yeah. I really like the last two tasks, like the fact that you introduced the others in the foraging task, and especially this one is, I think, relevant for general exploring personality. And any questions about this last talk, or anyone? Just go, Neil, please.
Lots of questions. Really enjoyed the talk, Chris.
Thank you.
So I guess one question about the last study is that conceptual trait space. Is that I missed whether that was fitted sort of for each subject specifically, or you do it over the whole group and then apply that to each subject?
Oh yeah, no, I didn't say it. So this similarity matrix is based on an independent data set.
Okay.
Of just like over 800 people, just rating themselves, and then basically just do the correlation. But I mean, it's true. So what we're missing is basically how do you learn that trait space in the beginning? And I mean, you might think helpful and generous have two very separate traits, and I think they're the same. So there's also individual difference in how we understand these traits. So we haven't addressed that. We actually have one fMRI study where we're using representational similarity analysis to see how this is represented, and kind of currently investigating whether it's kind of the brain activity is better explained by your individual similarity space or by the general similarity space. So for this study, we have actually asked people to rate the similarities as well. But it's kind of a not thing to do, because if you want to assess it, you need to ask a lot of questions. And,
Yeah. And I guess I'm interested, like whether, I don't know if this makes sense, but whether you really think it's like a case of like you update, potentially like 40 different traits to different degrees, or whether it's more a case of like there are really 4 or 5, if you did like factor analysis or whatever, it's really 4 or 5 key things that are getting updated, and that's getting sort of, different combination of those.
Yes, so we have that actually in the model space. So we basically have a model where it just said we have each trait kind of belongs to one of the big 5 factors, and then you're basically learning 5 estimates. And I mean, conceptually in the model space, it's saying you turn the similarity matrix into a matrix of zeros and ones. Now we lost me.
Sorry, yeah, that makes sense. I heard your reply.
And so this more fine-grained similarity matrix works better. But we also have one study where we basically made up the profiles. So Tim was kind of invented on the basis of just the big five. And for that kind of almost arbitrary profile that didn't kind of conform to the usual similarity space, this simpler model works better. But I guess it's like a super interesting question to investigate that further.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like that, if I got it correctly, is that as if we all have some kind of big five in our mind in which we try to describe the others, and it tells you more. That what you try to do tells you more about how stereotypical we are when we try to understand the others. Like if you have to fit some kind of stereotypical knowledge of the other. Like if you the other one. And it's really good. I was thinking, just an idea. When you show the task, when they have to they update proportionally to the estimation error. So if they say how much team is nice, happy, whatever, and they say 5, and then they got the feedback that he is gentle, whatever, 10. That's kind of on a 0 to 10 scale. It's a huge prediction error. But the point is, how much does that? What's the final aim? Like they have to know to understand team, because for example, if I expect team being nice 5, and he says, "Oh no, I'm nice 10," I'm a bit annoyed by team. I kind of dislike team a bit. Like, did you ask, like, at the end of the experiment how they actually see the team?
Yeah, so it's a super good point. We haven't related it to kind of actual behavior afterwards. Not that we tell them, okay, and afterwards you will do a task with him, and therefore it's important that you get to know him also. So we haven't done that. I think that would be interesting. And we asked them kind of very generally how they like persons, and then in this manipulated situation where there's one guy or one profile who says they're always like very good, then people don't like that person too much. So it's kind of a bit boasting. But yeah, and so what we've also done more on the computation level is getting testing models where we have different learning rates for positive and negative information in a way that Neil has shown. And I think this doesn't help in that task. So it's not, the model is not better, but that might very easily change by introducing some different contexts and so on.
Please, Dagur, if you got a question, or did you?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure how I came to this webinar. No, I don't have any question at the moment. I just came in.
Okay.
But greetings from Iceland. How did I register for this course?
I have no idea.
I have no idea either. But I'm a psychiatrist in Iceland, so maybe this is something for me.
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist, and welcome anyway.
Yeah.
Through Facebook.
Maybe I can ask another question if there's no other ones.
Sure.
To Chris, is on the foraging task, did you look at all at sort of how people's choices were affected by the time window? Like you can imagine, if they're at the end of the time window versus at the start, that might sort of change risky, how much they use the heuristic on risk and stuff like that.
So in a way, this optimal policy takes that into account, because it's kind of calculated kind of backwards. So basically, you have to imagine what would you do in the last time step, and then you go kind of backwards to the present. So there's some heuristics that kind of can only be relevant during the later stages. So one heuristic is something I called wait when safe. So basically, once you're kind of in the last, let's say you have 5 energy points and only 4 days left. So that means you can just, it doesn't matter what you do. You could just wait. That's the safer option. And some people do that. And that was actually a heuristic that kind of came up by asking participants how they approach the tasks. Yeah, you have this kind of 2 things. On the one hand, it becomes a bit irrelevant what you do the closer you're to the end, if you're rich enough. On the other hand, thinking kind of a time step further makes kind of tinier changes in the between waiting and foraging. So at some point, whether I'm thinking ahead 5 days or 6 days doesn't matter so much. So because you have this kind of, the further away it is, less important it is also.
Yeah, but I guess, is it true though that the more steps there are, then the more complicated that calculating that optimal policy is. Right? So then you might think that people might go more with heuristics. The more, that's the sort of the idea behind some of the heuristics, like pruning, for example, right? I think.
Exactly. Yeah. So Quentin's task where you kind of say you're pruning situations that are so bad, that would be interesting. We can't really do it in our task because we don't have these massive losses in the same way, but something like that, I think, might well go. Yeah.
Any other question? I was wondering if in the foraging task, like you've got, for example, people, when you introduce the predator, the wolf, so they have to choose between foraging and stay at home, for example, right? So did you guys have association with self-reported variable like temperament or like the big 5 between the participants? Like, because, for example, if I'm a bit avoidant or like anxious individual, I'd rather starve to death than being eaten by a wolf.
Yeah. I think in that sense, it would be really nice to combine it with the uncertainty that, like Neil and also Adam had. You have that in your task where it's not kind of completely known what the probabilities are and so on, or the magnitudes, and then you might underestimate or overestimate the risk, and then this would lead you to never find out that the risk is actually lower than you think it is, for example. Maybe I have a question to Neil. So did you actually vary the length of the good and bad environments?
The blocks, no, they're both the same amount of time. Time is the constraint you have to maximize over, really. So yeah. Are you thinking like we could have made the poor environment longer or something so they could get the same amount from it? Or?
Yes, it's super fascinating that you see this asymmetry in the learning, that kind of one switch results in some learning, the other doesn't. So, I mean, at some point, you also need to learn that is bad in a way, right?
Yeah, so they don't. I mean, it's not like they don't learn if they start in the rich and they go into the poor. It's not like they don't learn at all. It's just a very slow drop off. You see such a big change. We did do a third experiment, which I didn't talk about, where we basically, between the rich and poor environment, or poor and rich, whichever order you had them in, we introduced like a terrible environment where you just see the worst option for like a while. And the thinking there was that would, even if you start in the rich environment, you're then getting so much sort of bad information that when you then go into the poor environment, you should now be low enough that you'll actually switch your behavior a lot. And that's what people do. Like that,
okay.
You get the same magnitude of change in choices for both groups if you sandwich it with this terrible environment. So it really does suggest that it's, you know, product of the way they're sort of learning that's creating the effect, I think.
Cool. I really enjoyed the 3 talks because I know each of you like separately from different background studies, whatever, and I really like how this whole symposium came out, because to me, I'm, as being the organizer, I'm surprised how many connections there are between what you are doing, each of you, and it would be super fascinating. Like, to me, like my take-home messages is like, okay, we've got the uncertainty, we've got the different learning rate from good and bad news, and we've got to account from the even unpredictability of the wolf and the others as well, if they can be trustworthy or not trustworthy, or how can I imagine the others. And I think that all these 3 dimensions, they can be particularly interesting in several psychiatric diagnoses, especially because when we have like a depressive episode, you just what we do is that consider depression like all the same. So all the patients depressed are like all the same. But would be interesting. But the truth is that we all come from different temperament and personalities. So would be interesting to see how these traits interact with the environment in triggering the depressive episode, and maybe shaping different depressive episodes, because the fact that you might not find like a group effect, maybe exactly because you did not consider like baseline traits, like that might affect the learning rate differently. As like, but yeah, super fascinating. Like, and my idea would be just try all the tasks you showed and give like personality questionnaires, temperament questionnaire, and see what if can explain further the differences, the biases, and everything. Like,
Yeah, definitely agree. I think just a lot of interesting synergies. Definitely, you know, thinking, you know, Erdem's stuff about volatility. You know, a question is maybe volatility is sort of to some extent creating a threatening environment. So then, what would that effect would that have on asymmetric learning? You know, and then I think Chris is sort of thinking how that asymmetry might play out in the context of like prospective planning, which my foraging task doesn't really have. Like, that model's all about like the history of reward, but then thinking sort of more like how that would play out prospectively over 3 steps, 4 steps in the future is also really interesting, I think. And, you know, maybe they all sort of overlap, or it's just on different symptoms, you know, of depression and other disorders. Who knows? Or maybe it's all one. You know, it'd be interesting to know.
any question? Any other concluding remarks? Someone that wants to add something? Thoughts? Idea?
I found your longitudinal bipolar disorder idea to Neil's task very interesting, because it can really, experience of depression and mania can actually, and then the vice versa, from mania to depression can actually change the way people experience environments. But I'm practically just wondering whether it will be possible to recruit that many patients to have a strong power to, dissociate how those transitions actually influence people's experience of environments and behavioral adjustment. That would be very interesting. Maybe a multi-site kind of study.
Yeah. Well, it only took you what, 6 years for that last paper, Paolo?
No rush. Just if my professor doesn't want to fire me in the next years, no, why not? And that's a good point. Like what I read about the whole point of cognitive models, that modeling the mood, so depressive mood and manic mood in bipolar disorder is still a bit controversial. Like there's it's a book chapter by Amy Cochrane where she described all the mathematical model of bipolar disorder. And the truth is that trying to model bipolar disorder only as mood is never enough satisfying, because you've got like mixed episode in which you've got at the same time manic symptoms and depressive symptoms. And that's a kind of tricky when you consider mood on a continuum from good to bad. And at the same time, some like classic description says that bipolar disorder is like not only mood, but is thoughts overactivation or slowdown, and motor activation or motor slowdown. So to me, what would be interesting, it would be just having a task that it can actually grasp 3 different dimension. And probably in that sense, yeah, there is mood, but one of the good questions about bipolar disorder is what comes first. It's like I'm sad and then I slow down and my thoughts are slower, or I'm activated and that boosts my mood. I'm not aware of any definitive answer to that, though. But now let's first try with the foraging task with the depressed subject and the substance abuse, and then we'll see if they understand it, if it works. Yeah. Because we are kind of, the preliminary results are not as expected, though. But no spoiler.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a question for the psychiatrist. So do you think that this kind of line of research can also help you to change the therapies, kind of incorporating some of these games into practice? Or like, how does it relate to what you're doing in psychotherapy in a way? It's a very open question. I mean,
yeah. I think like I have colleagues that are definitely more prepared than me to answer this question. Yeah, here she is. Chiara, do you want to intervene and save me from this broad? Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, no, actually, I was meaning to jump in just to say to all the 3 of you, thank you very much for these talks, really fascinating talks. I must confess that I understood just, well, I think 25% of what you said, because my computational psychiatry knowledge is less than 0. But I think that they all have strong implications for clinical practice. My question for, I guess, all the 3 of you, if I can, is do you, it's just a theoretical question, before designing those paradigms and applying your computational methods, so developing the algorithms and so on, do you have in mind a clinical hypothesis on how various patients with several psychiatric disorders could differ from healthy controls on each of those tasks. Because when I hear you, I can generate hypotheses in my mind about some kind of patients, but I think that you are in the better position to show us whether, well, what guided your thinking in clinical terms.
Yeah.
So I can take one shot at that maybe with the forage, some of the foraging stuff anyway. This is again an idea from Quentin Hoy's, is that your estimate of how rewarding an environment is, so how much, you know, how much you can get from the environment, might be related to some of the symptoms you see in depression. So things like sleeping a lot, you know, staying in bed, or like not eating very much, for example. And the basic idea is that if you think your environment has a very low reward rate, so it's not going to give you very much, then why should you expend the energy to, like, you know, gain enough calories, or, like, you know, get out of bed in the morning if there's nothing sort of out there. So it can explain some of those symptoms and not others as well, because also I know other symptoms of depression are like eating too much, or like not sleeping enough, right? So it seems to be sort of selective on some of those things and like not explain other traits as well. But that's the basic idea, and yeah.
Yeah. We actually had a very specific hypothesis, for example, in the case of equal information content, when both win and loss outcomes are informative in reinforcement learning tasks, we thought that that can capture the negative bias in depression, because that would be the operational definition. You know, you have two things, negative and positive things happening together, but you preferentially process negative things more than the positive things. So that is the kind of behavior that we expected in patients with depression, but actually we haven't seen that strongly. So from that perspective, what we initially thought would happen did not happen in the patient cohort. Yeah. So it's always going back to the drawing board and trying to make sense of things with a, you know, post hoc hypothesis, but yeah.
Yeah, we also have sometimes a bit this problem that you're kind of stuck in a model, I think, at least I am, and then you kind of try what you can do in a way. But what we try now is kind of in personality disorder with this social foraging task to see if they basically punished an interaction partner for doing something that was kind of beneficial for the other partner, that was not directed against the patient, but it was necessary. So basically the other person had to survive, and by kind of maximizing his or her own kind of survival also hurts the borderline patient, and then understanding whether this is particularly problematic for the borderline patient, so that they're kind of unforgiving in such situations where somebody else had to be selfish. That's one line we're testing, but no results yet. No.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, regarding your question, Christoph, about psychotherapy, well, that was the answer, I think, is related to my former question. So I'm wondering about the specificity of the results for each clinical population, because as Neil said before, well, in a syndrome, there are so many symptoms. So a performance on a task and the computational model related to that could be driven by those symptoms, but not others. So I would be very interested in knowing exactly which mechanism are tapping those tasks and those paradigms in clinical syndromes. I think that's important also. Well, because for instance, your social learning task, well, that could have potentially psychotherapy implications, but only if we know what it is exactly measuring. So I don't know. But thank you very much. It was really exciting. Thank you for virtually coming.
Thank you, Chiara. So it's our time, it's almost over. There are questions. Any further questions? If not, I want to thank all the speakers for joining us and for explaining us their amazing results. I want to thank the participant for staying with us for 2 hours, and that I understand can be kind of demanding, but if it's okay for you, the video will be uploaded and I'll be able to share it. So if you missed something or you want to focus on something or the references and everything, you can watch the video again on YouTube. And I see Professor Marchese, do you want to add something? Just like the Pope, it's a high like the Pope.
Bye-bye. I understand about the 10% of your presentation. But
So,
I'm older than you.
So Chiara got 15 more. So congrats, Chiara. So I thank all of you, and again a round of applause for all the speakers. And yeah, I hope that these help you in thinking to the tasks, and we are available if you got more clinical question or discussion, whatever, feel free to contact us. You've got my email and everything. And so thank you, everyone. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was great fun. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Take care.